The room went silent. I stood in the center of my father's mahogany-lined study, the air thick with the scent of expensive cigars and cold betrayal. My stepmother, Eleanor, sat behind the heavy oak desk that had belonged to my father for 30 years. Beside her stood Marcus, her son from a previous marriage, wearing a smirk that cost more than my car. The family lawyer, a man I'd known since childhood, wouldn't even look me in the eye. He stared intently at a single sheet of paper on the desk. "I'll repeat it for you, Ethan, since you seem to be struggling with the concept," Eleanor said, her voice like silk over gravel. "Your father died with nothing but debts. The house, the firm, the offshore accounts, they were all leveraged to the hilt. There is no inheritance. In fact, you're lucky we aren't charging you for the funeral expenses." I looked at the official assets summary she pushed toward me. It was a joke. My father was a titan of the shipping industry. He didn't just have money, he had empires. But according to this document, he was a pauper. I looked at Marcus, who was busy checking his gold Rolex. He had spent his whole life treating me like the charity case son, even though I was the one who actually stayed late at the office while he was out clubbing on the company dime. "So that's it?" I asked, my voice calm, betraying none of the fire starting to simmer in my chest. 25 years of building a legacy, and he leaves his only biological son with what, exactly? Eleanor reached into a drawer and pulled out a small, rusted tin box. She tossed it onto the desk. It landed with a hollow thud. "He left you his treasures, a few old coins and a handwritten note about hard work, very poetic. Now, you have exactly 1 hour to vacate the guest house. The locks are being changed at sunset." Marcus let out a short, sharp laugh. "Don't worry, little brother. I'll make sure to donate your old clothes to a shelter. You might need to visit it soon." I didn't argue. I didn't beg. I picked up the rusted tin box and turned to leave. As I reached the door, I felt the weight of the box. It felt heavier than it should have. Just as I stepped into the hallway, a man stepped out of the shadows of the corridor. It was Mr. Sterling, my father's personal accountant for 40 decades. He looked terrified. He leaned in, his breath smelling of peppermint and anxiety, and whispered 5 words that changed everything. "The ledger isn't in there." I didn't stop. I kept walking toward my car, the rusted tin box tucked under my arm like a piece of junk. Behind me, I could hear Eleanor and Marcus laughing in the study, likely toasting to their successful heist. They thought I was the quiet, simple son, the one who would go off and find a 9-to-5 job and disappear into the footnotes of their history. They had spent years conditioning the world to see me as a nobody and replaceable shadow in my father's light. When I reached my beat-up sedan, I didn't drive to the guest house. I drove to a 24-hour diner 3 miles away. 5 minutes later, Mr. Sterling pulled up in his modest hatchback. He sat across from me in a corner booth, his hands trembling as he clutched a coffee cup. "Ethan, they'll kill me if they know I'm talking to you," he hissed. His eyes darted toward the door. "Eleanor has people everywhere. She's been planning this for 3 years, ever since your father's first stroke. She forced me to sign off on those fraudulent asset summaries." "Why tell me now, Sterling?" I asked, setting the rusted tin box on the table. "You watched them strip me of my birthright in that room. You sat there and let them lie." "Because your father knew," Sterling whispered. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a sealed envelope with a wax seal I hadn't seen in years. It was the seal of my father's private foundation. He knew what they were. He knew Marcus was funneling money into offshore shells. He told me that if the day ever came where the vault was empty, I was to give you this. He called it his insurance policy against vipers. I looked at the envelope. My name was written in my father's sharp, disciplined cursive. Inside, I didn't find a check. I found a single flash drive and a key to a locker at the main train station. "They think they've won, Ethan," Sterling said, his voice gaining a bit of strength. "They think they've scrubbed the accounts clean, but they forgot one thing. I'm the one who built the system, and I kept a second set of books." Just as he pushed the envelope toward me, his phone chimed. His face went pale. "They know. Eleanor's security team tracked my GPS. You have to go, now." As I stood up, a black SUV pulled into the diner parking lot. Two men in suits stepped out, their eyes locked on our booth. I barely made it to my car before the black SUV blocked the diner's exit. I didn't panic. I knew these streets better than any hired muscle Eleanor could employ. I cut through the alleyway, my tires screaming against the asphalt, and disappeared into the evening traffic. My heart was hammering, but my mind was cold. Quietly, I had been recording every conversation in that house for months, but this was the physical proof I needed. I reached the guest house 10 minutes before sunset. I didn't go for my clothes. I went for the floorboard under my bed. I pulled out my evidence folder, a collection of email backups and recorded meetings I'd been gathering since Marcus started restructuring the company. I added the sealed envelope to the pile. Suddenly, the front door burst open. Marcus stood there, flanked by two heavy-set guards. He wasn't smiling anymore. He looked livid. "Where is he, Ethan? Where's Sterling?" "I don't know what you're talking about, Marcus," I said, standing up slowly. I kept my hands visible. "I was just packing my treasures like your mother told me to." Marcus kicked my suitcase across the room, clothes spilling everywhere. "The accountant is missing, and he took a ledger with him. My mother thinks you have it. If you're hiding company property, that's a felony. Give it to me, or I'll have these gentlemen find it on your person." "You already said Dad died with nothing," I reminded him, my voice steady. "If there's no money, how can there be a ledger worth stealing? You're contradicting your own lies." Marcus stepped closer, his face inches from mine. "Listen to me, you pathetic loser. You are nothing. You've always been nothing. My mother and I have the deeds, the board votes, and the law on our side. You're just a guest who overstayed his welcome." He turned to the guards. "Throw him out. Empty his pockets. If he resists, use force." The guards moved in. They grabbed my arms, pinning me against the wall. They went through my pockets, tossing my phone and wallet onto the floor. But they missed the hidden compartment in my jacket where the flash drive was tucked. Marcus picked up my phone and smashed it under his heel. "No more recordings, Ethan. You're homeless, broke, and now you're disconnected." They dragged me to the edge of the property and threw me onto the gravel. The heavy iron gates slammed shut. As I sat there in the dirt, I reached into my jacket and felt the cold metal of the train station key. They thought they had broken me. They didn't realize they'd just given me the motive to destroy them. The rain started around midnight. I was sitting at a cheap motel room on the outskirts of the city, staring at the flash drive plugged into a burner laptop. My father's insurance policy was a masterpiece of forensic accounting. It didn't just show where the money went. It showed exactly how Eleanor and Marcus had forged his signature while he was semi-conscious in his hospital bed. But I needed more. To take down a titan like Eleanor, you don't just need proof of theft, you need to prove she's currently committing a crime that the authorities can't ignore. I opened the folder marked Project Phoenix. My eyes widened. It wasn't just my father's money they were stealing. They were using the shipping firm to move unregistered cargo for a conglomerate that was under federal investigation. My father had been a silent whistleblower. He'd been gathering evidence against his own wife to protect the family name, but the stroke hit before he could pull the trigger. I looked at the clock. Tomorrow was the annual board of directors meeting. Eleanor was planning to announce a total buyout, which would effectively clean the company and erase the paper trail forever. If I didn't act within the next 12 hours, the evidence on this drive would be useless. I heard a soft knock on the door. I grabbed a heady glass ashtray, my muscles tensing. "Who is it?" "It's the person who actually knows how to read an accountant ledger," a female voice whispered. I opened the door an inch. It was Sarah, my father's former lead counsel who'd been fired by Eleanor 3 months ago. She looked exhausted, her eyes rimmed with red. She held a thick leather-bound book in her arms, the real ledger Sterling had mentioned. "Sterling didn't make it to his safe house, Ethan," she said, her voice trembling. "But he got this to me before they took him. He told me you'd be the only one with the decryption key. The key isn't a code, Sarah, I said, letting her in. I opened the rusted tin box Eleanor had thrown at me. I pulled out the worthless old coins. I stacked them on the table in a specific order: 1982, 1995, 2004, the dates of the firm's 3 biggest acquisitions. The coins weren't just currency, they were physical keys. I pressed the 2004 coin into the spine of the ledger, and a hidden compartment clicked open. Inside was a micro SD card and a handwritten letter from my father. "The board meeting is at 9 a.m., Sarah said, her voice trembling. "Eleanor has the police on standby to keep you away from the building. How are you going to get in?" I looked at the letter. A small smile touched my lips. "I don't need to get in. I already own the building. They just don't know it yet." By 8 a.m. the next morning, the corporate headquarters was a fortress. Security guards in crisp black uniforms patrolled the lobby, and every entrance required a biometric scan. Eleanor was leaving nothing to chance. She wanted the buyout to go through smoothly, turning her into a billionaire and me into a memory. I stood across the street, wearing a high-visibility vest and carrying a toolbox. To the world, I was just another technician coming to check the HVAC system. It's amazing how invisible you become when you're wearing a uniform that implies you're there to work. I walked right past the guards. I didn't use the front door. I used the service elevator, using a key card I'd kept from my summer internship years ago. Inside the vents, the air was cold and metallic. I moved with the silence of a man who had spent his life being underestimated. I reached the ceiling crawl space directly above the boardroom. Below me, I could hear the muffled voices of the board members. "We have the majority vote," Marcus was saying, his voice booming with unearned confidence. "The audit is complete. The assets are verified. My mother is ready to sign the transition papers." "Wait," an older voice interrupted. It was Mr. Gable, the longest-serving board member. "We haven't heard from the primary beneficiary. Where is Ethan? The bylaws state he must be present for a total liquidation of family shares." "Ethan has waived his rights." Eleanor's voice was smooth as ice. "He's struggled with personal issues since his father's passing. We've provided him with a generous settlement, and he's chosen to move on. Here is the signed waiver." I watched through the vent as she slid a piece of paper across the table. It was a forgery, and a bad one at that. But the board members, eager for their payouts, didn't look too closely. They just wanted the deal done. "Very well," Gable sighed. "If there are no further objections—" "I have an objection," I said, my voice projecting through the vent system, echoing strangely in the room. The board members jumped. Eleanor froze, her pen hovering over the signature line. "Who said that?" I kicked the vent cover open. I didn't fall. I lowered myself down with the grace of someone who had practiced this move a dozen times. I landed on the long mahogany table, right in front of Eleanor. I wasn't wearing the vest anymore. I was in a tailored suit my father had made for my 21st birthday, the one Eleanor thought she'd burned. "The nobody has arrived," I said, looking her directly in the eye. "And I brought the real paperwork." The room went silent. Marcus lunged at me, his face purple with rage. "Security, get this lunatic out of here. He's trespassing." "Sit down, Marcus," I said, not even looking at him. I pulled out the DNA test paper I'd obtained weeks ago and slid it toward Mr. Gable. "Before we discuss the company, let's discuss the family, because according to the bylaws, only a blood-related heir can serve as chairperson if the previous owner dies intestate." Eleanor's eyes went wide. She tried to grab the paper, but Gable was faster. He put on his glasses and read the results. His face drained of color. He looked at Marcus, then at Eleanor, then back to the paper. This can't be right," Gable whispered. "What is it?" one of the other board members asked. "Marcus is not my father's son," I said, my voice echoing in the sterile room. "But more importantly, he's not who he says he is. Eleanor, do you want to tell them about your first husband, the one who didn't die in an accident, but is currently serving 20 years for corporate espionage, the one Marcus has been visiting in prison every month?" The room exploded into whispers. Eleanor looked like she wanted to melt into the floor. This was the first twist. The golden son was a fraud, and his true father was a rival of our firm. Marcus wasn't just a stepson, he was a Trojan horse. "That's a lie," Eleanor screamed. "That test is forged. You're just a bitter, penniless boy trying to steal what we built." "I haven't even gotten to the best part," I said, opening my laptop and connecting it to the boardroom's massive projector screen. "Let's talk about where the money went, because it didn't disappear into debts. It went into a shell company called Apex Logistics, a company owned by, let's see." I hit a key. A document appeared on the screen. It was a wire transfer for $50 million. The recipient wasn't Eleanor, it wasn't Marcus. It was the old grandpa's lawyer, the one who had disappeared shortly after my father's funeral. "But here's the shocker," I said, leaning over the table. "The lawyer didn't steal it. He was holding it in escrow for the person my father actually named as his successor." I clicked the next slide. It was the second hidden page of the will. At the bottom, in bold letters, it didn't say my name. It said the name of my father's secret, illegitimate daughter, a daughter Eleanor had spent 20 years trying to hide.
The revelation of a secret sister sent the board into a frenzy, but Eleanor was a cornered predator. She didn't panic. She pivoted. She looked at the board members, her expression shifting from shock to a mask of deep concern. "He's insane," she said, her voice trembling with fake emotion. "Ethan has been obsessed with these conspiracy theories for years. He's forged these documents to distract you from the truth. He's the one who's been draining the accounts." She snapped her fingers, and Marcus pulled out a folder of his own. He threw a stack of bank statements onto the table. They showed my name, my signature, and dozens of unauthorized transfers from the company's main account to a private offshore bank. "We found these in his guest house last night," Marcus lied, his voice steady now. "He's been stealing from his own father for years. That's why he was cut out of the will. He's a thief trying to blame the victims." I looked at the statements. They were perfect. The signatures were indistinguishable from mine. They had even timed the transfers to coincide with my trips out of town. It was a professional frame job. "The police are already on their way, Ethan," Eleanor said, a cruel smirk returning to her lips. "We called them the moment you stepped into this building. You'll be spending the next 10 years in a cell while we fix the mess you've made." 2 police officers entered the boardroom. They looked at Eleanor, then at me. "Ethan Vance, you're under arrest for grand larceny and corporate fraud." The board members looked at me with disgust. Gable shook his head. "I wanted to believe you, Ethan, but the evidence is right here." The officers moved toward me, handcuffs clicking. I didn't move. I didn't fight. I looked at the lead officer, a man I'd seen talking to Marcus in the parking lot earlier. He was on their payroll. "Wait," I said, my voice echoing. "Before you take me away, I'd like to show you one more thing. It's a video from my father's study, recorded the night he died." "We've already seen the security footage," Marcus shouted. "There's nothing there." "Not the security footage," I said, reaching into my pocket and pulling out a small, old phone recording. The nanny cam my father hid in the smoke detector, the one that records audio and video in high definition, even in the dark. I hit play. The projector screen flickered to life. The image was grainy but clear enough. It showed my father's bedroom. He was in bed, hooked up to a ventilator, looking frail. Eleanor was standing over him, but she wasn't comforting him. She was holding a pillow. "Just sign the damn merger, Arthur." Her voice came through the speakers, cold and venomous. "If you sign it, I'll let the boy live. If you don't, I'll make sure Ethan dies in a car accident before your body is even cold." The room went deathly silent. Every board member stared at the screen in horror. The video showed my father feebly pushing a pen across a document, the very waiver Eleanor had shown earlier. She had coerced it at pillow point.
But the video didn't stop there. It showed Marcus entering the room. He was carrying a syringe. "Is it done?" he asked. "Ethan signed it," Eleanor said. "Inject him. The doctor will call it a secondary stroke." Marcus stepped toward the bed. My father's eyes were wide with terror. Just as Marcus reached for the IV line, my father spoke his last words, his voice a raspy whisper. "The quiet man always records the vipers." I stopped the video. I looked at the two police officers. They were frozen, their hands still on their handcuffs. They weren't looking at me anymore. They were looking at Eleanor and Marcus. That video is a deep fake," Marcus screamed. "It's AI. You can't use that in court." "It's not AI, Marcus," I said, pulling a small, transparent bag from my pocket. Inside was the actual camera. "The forensic ink test on the waiver will prove it was signed at 3 a.m., the exact time on this timestamp. And the syringe, I found it in the trash that night. I have it in a safe deposit box, still containing your fingerprints and the traces of the potassium chloride you used to stop his heart." Eleanor slumped into her chair. She looked 100 years old. The board members backed away from her like a leper. Mr. Gable stood up, his face tight with fury. "Officers, arrest them, now, and don't even think about taking them to the local precinct. Call the state police." As the handcuffs were slapped onto Eleanor's wrists, she looked at me with pure, unadulterated hatred. You were always so quiet. We thought you were a coward." "I wasn't a coward. I was a witness." As Eleanor and Marcus were let out in shame, the boardroom remained in a state of shock. The nobodies they had mocked were now the only ones standing. But the drama wasn't over. Mr. Gable turned to me, his hands shaking as he held the second page of the will I'd shown earlier. "Ethan," he said, his voice hushed, "this daughter, this illegitimate child your father mentions, if she exists, she is the majority shareholder. Where is she? Who is she?" The board members lean in. This was the moment that would decide the fate of the billion-dollar empire. If this mystery girl appeared, she would own everything. If she didn't, the company would fall into a legal limbo that could last for decades. I looked at Sarah, the lawyer who had helped me. She gave me a small, knowing nod. "She's been here the whole time," I said. "She was the one who kept the books, the one who realized the money was being laundered, the one Eleanor tried to fire 3 months ago." I pointed to Sarah. The room gasped. Sarah stepped forward, her head held high. "My mother was my father's first love," she explained quietly. "They couldn't be together because of his family status. He supported us in secret our entire lives. He put me through law school so I could one day protect the legacy he knew Eleanor would try to destroy." "But wait," a board member shouted. "If Sarah is the heir, what happens to the buyout? What happens to our shares?" "The buyout is canceled," Sarah said firmly. "And as the new chairperson, my first act is to order a full audit of every board member's personal accounts. Anyone who took a bribe from Eleanor will be terminated immediately." Half the room went pale, but I wasn't looking at them. I was looking at the projector screen. I had one more file to play. "There's one more thing," I said. "The accountant, Mr. Sterling, he didn't just give me the ledger, he gave me a confession about the real reason my father's money was moved to escrow." I hit the final button. The screen showed a map of a property I recognized instantly. It was the old family estate, the one Eleanor had claimed was leveraged to the hilt. "There's a hidden basement safe," Sterling's voice narrated over the map. "And inside that safe isn't just money, it's the original deed to the city's port, the port that the conglomerate is trying to buy." I looked at the board. The company doesn't just own ships, we own the water they float on, and there's one clause Eleanor missed in her merger documents. I smiled, a cold, hard expression. The clause that says the deed can only be transferred by a male heir of the bloodline, me. The fallout was spectacular. Within 48 hours, the Apex Logistics shell company was seized by the federal government. Eleanor and Marcus were charged with first-degree murder, forgery, and racketeering.
They are currently awaiting trial, and because of the overwhelming evidence, the CCTV footage I'd recovered from the hallway and the accountant ledger, the DA is seeking the maximum sentence. The conglomerate that tried to buy the company collapsed overnight once their illegal dealings were exposed. The board was purged of every corrupt member, replaced with people who actually cared about my father's legacy. Sarah and I stood on the balcony of the penthouse office, looking out over the harbor. The ships were moving, the cranes were lifting, and for the first time in years, the air felt clean. "You're not going to stay, are you?" Sarah asked, turning to me. She was wearing the chairperson's pin now. She looked natural in it. "No," I said, leaning against the railing. "I like the quiet too much. You're the lawyer, Sarah. You're the one who can build the future. I'm just the one who made sure the past didn't bury us." I signed over my portion of the company to a trust that would fund scholarships for underprivileged students, the nobodies the world usually ignores. I kept enough to live comfortably, but I didn't want the empire. I wanted the peace my father never had. As I walked out of the building for the last time, I passed the security guard who had helped me sneak in. I handed him an envelope. Inside was enough to retire on. He looked at me, stunned. "Why me, sir?" he asked. "Because you saw me when everyone else looked through me." I got into my sedan, the same beat-up car Marcus had mocked, and started the engine. I didn't look back at the glass tower. I didn't need to. The truth was out. The villains were in chains, and the name Vance meant something honorable again. People often ask me how I stayed so calm when my world was burning. I tell them the same thing my father wrote in that last letter in the tin box. They called me nobody until the judge read my name. Never underestimate the quiet man, because while you're busy making noise, he's busy making notes. And karma always keeps the receipts.